Sigils are cool, y'all. And they're one of those bits of magical lore and practice that transcends time, place, culture, system, and tradition. So while we can't necessarily say that they are just reserved for witches and witchcraft, there is absolutely no denying that they are indeed a part of traditional classical witchcraft and definitely a part of contemporary modern craft. So it's kind of like a blend of both worlds. Today we're going to be talking about sigils, and as a little bonus, I am going to create a different sigil for each of the styles that we're discussing, all for one single magical purpose. So let's jump into that. Laurelei Black here from Blade and Broom, and I am fully prepared to be your favorite witchy aunt here in the secret garden cottage that I have created for ritual and witchcraft discussions and getting into all kinds of witchy goodness with you. So, where was I going? Oh yeah. If you're new here, please subscribe and click the bell for notifications. And if you are returning, welcome back. Thank you so much. We do have a Patreon for the channel if you'd like to help support what it is that we've got going on here. And there's lots of extra freebies and fun stuff happening over there, of course. The link for that, as well as the link for my Linktree, which shares with you all of the stuff I'm getting up to, which is a lot of magical goodness. Is all down in the description box below, as well as links for all kinds of resources that are going to be shared throughout this video. So if you've got questions, check out that description box and they'll probably be answered there. Like we do around here, let's get something in these teacups and get to talking about magic. I cheated, I already had stuff in mine. Okay, so we're going to be talking about 5 different sigil styles today, and by the end of the video we will have created 5 different sigils for one magical intention, which is a lot, probably a little excessive. You don't need that many necessarily for one, but again, you do your craft the way you want to. I just want to give you options. I would love to hear in the comments what sigil practice you are really drawn to, and if there's something different that you're doing that I'm not sharing here, by all means share links to it, describe it, inform us. We like that around here. Okay, so first off, let's talk about what a sigil is. The word sigil itself, which is kind of an odd sounding word outside of the realms of magic, we don't really use it outside of that, but the word sigil comes from the Latin word sigillum, which means a seal. And in this particular case, it was developed to mean like a mark of authority or authenticity, but it was also used as the kind of seal that you would use to like seal something inside of, for instance, a vessel or a container, or a seal like a wax seal on an envelope, that kind of seal, so that you know that only the right person had access to it. For instance, in modern magical context, the word sigil still has all of those connotations in place, but it also mixes in some other usages. So we're going to cover some of those things as well. Typically, when a witch or a mage is talking about a sigil, they're talking about a symbol or a set of symbols, some kind of mark that has been created either by them or by somebody in the past, that carries a specific meaning, usually a magical meaning that's related to a magical outcome, or that's an identifier for a kind of spirit. Those are typically what a sigil is representing, is either a magical outcome or a spirit. So there are lots and lots of ways to create sigils, and I'm going to state right off the bat that absolutely none of them are wrong or bad or invalid. And anybody that tries to make you feel like they are you don't need them. You don't need them in your life. They're not a good person. Just stay away from them. There are some sigil traditions that are older than others. There are some that are really particular to a certain group, and those might make certain systems more of a draw for you personally, and that's perfectly fine. But that doesn't mean that people that are in that group can only use that sigil style, or that that newer systems are somehow less authentic than older systems. One of the cool things about sigil crafting is that this is one of those areas where you really get the opportunity to play around with your crafting and with your magic and figure out what works best for you. Some styles of sigil crafting are going to work better, or might work better, for people who are really drawn to a spirit model or a spirit-based magical system, where others might work better for people who are very psychological model, or who are very like mathematically or inclined or analytical and that type of thing. So let's go ahead and talk about some of those ways to create sigils. And you'll see me kind of doing it as we're talking, but I'll save the big reveal for the end. So the first kind that we're going to talk about is the spirit-derived model, or the trance-derived method of creating a sigil. It could be argued that this is the oldest type of sigil creation. What you do with this model is that you enter into either a type of trance in a ritual setting, or into spirit communication, again, usually in a ritual setting, and either through that visionary work or through spirit communication, you are given a sigil. The idea here is that the sigil isn't necessarily coming from you. It's not something that you're creating either based on a pattern or a system that already exists. It's something that's divinely inspired or spiritually inspired. In cases like this, the symbol itself might be a representation of the spirit who gave you the symbol, as opposed to being a representation of the magical outcome itself. Or it could be a representation of the magical outcome itself. So it's important to know when you receive that sigil, like to maybe ask questions of the spirit, or to do a little investigation within your trance work and within your visionary work in order to understand what the purpose and use of that sigil is. Because if it's a spirit's symbol, what you're doing when you use it is that you're actually calling upon that spirit to do the magical work on your behalf. Whereas if the sigil is the outcome itself, or related to the outcome itself, then there might be another method of activating that. The classic example of a spirit-derived or trance-derived, vision-derived sigil are actually the 72 sigils that are related to the 72 spirits of the Lemegeton, or the Goetia. So those spirits each have their own sigil or their own seal. Some of them have two, and they are symbols that are used to contact that spirit. And the magician or the witch who's contacting them can use that sigil to meditate upon and focus on and call that spirit into physical manifestation. And a lot of the old instructions, and I disagree with this part, but that's a whole different video. A lot of the instructions talk about using that sigil then on a metal disc or something in order to seal the spirit into a jar or into a vessel, so that they are there and trapped to do your bidding, which personally I think is atrocious. But and I advocate a lot against doing such a thing. But those are other videos, and I've done other videos on that, and I'll continue to do other videos on that, and you can check out the whole playlist related to spirit work for more information about that. So one of the things that's really interesting about these sigils is that in the very earliest manuscripts that are associated with these spirits, there weren't sigils listed. So for instance, in the Pseudomonarchia Demonium by Johann Wehr, no sigils, no seals, no marks, nothing like that. But 100 years later, by the time Dr. Thomas Rudd has recorded and transferred almost verbatim, but not quite, but a lot of these same spirits. It's a lot of those same spirits. By the time he has his copy of this spirit index, the spirit dictionary, he has copies of sigils. Now, whether he's the one who went into the trance state or he was working with a partner, because that seer and magician concept, that scryer and magician partnership was very common back in the Middle Ages. Whether he and a partner went in search of those sigils and they were the ones that recorded it or not, I don't know. But certainly, somewhere between Johann Wehr and Thomas Rudd, sigils had been received by somebody. So it's a process of communicating with those spirits and getting to know them in more depth. One of the things that I find really funny, though, is that by the time Crowley and Mathers translated a lot of these documents and manuscripts from the British Museum that ended up becoming the copies of the Goetia, the Ars Goetia, the Lemegeton, the Lesser Key of Solomon, all these names that you want to call these collected works. By the time those copies got published and with the new translations in 1904, this magical thing happens where their descriptions, and the sigils become very codified, and people are like, no, you can't use a different sigil for Baal. You have to use this one. And no, he's the first spirit. He's not anywhere else in the order. Which is interesting, and maybe Baal is not a great example because he is first, for instance, in a lot of the other orders too, but some of the other spirits show up in vastly different orders. They're just sort of in the order that the magician met them and not necessarily in the order that they're ranked or in an order that necessarily means something based on their number. But because that's sort of the text that a lot of modern magicians are using, you can't use any other sigil besides those sigils, is the thought, but it's not accurate. And I would challenge you to, if you're really working deeply with a spirit, ask them what sigil they would like for you to use, what sigil might be more meaningful for them, for you, because it might not be what's printed in the books. There might be something else that would be a better key for you, a better calling card for you than what Thomas Rudd used, for instance. This is where I get to make a note that I've gone through this process myself. For all of those spirits in the Goetia, I offer alternative sigils in my Witch's Key to the Legion, which has a new edition forthcoming soon. Stay tuned. I'll have links and stuff. It'll be a big deal. So the super short version, the big takeaway here is that a spirit with a history of contact with humans across the ages can give you a brand new sigil that nobody else has ever seen before, that may or may not be related to other sigils that are already in place, and it will be perfectly valid and perfectly usable, at the very least, for you. It may not do anything at all for me. It may not do anything at all for one of your coven mates or for somebody else who works even closely with that sigil. It may just be for you. But there's something that's kind of cool about that, and it's definitely totally valid and worth looking into. Okay, so moving away from the spirit-derived methods, the trance-derived methods, and going into more analytical-based methods, more sort of structured-based methods. If you are into math, you are going to love the Kamea Method, or the Kamea Method. I've heard it pronounced both ways. I'm going to say Kamea because I like that pronunciation, but the Kamea Method was taught and popularized by Henry Cornelius Agrippa, who wrote 3 books of occult philosophy, which is a magical classic, and a whole bunch of Western magical practices are sort of derived from that book. But I'm going to say that I am not a math person. I'm going to show you a short version. of how to use the Kamea Method. If you are really familiar with the Kamea Method, don't beat me up about this, because you can, there are other places, if you're really into this, if this appeals to you, to go and look in more depth, and I'll point you in those directions in the links. The short version with this is that you start with a magic number square, a magic number table that's related to the planetary energy that is most aligned with your magical outcome, or with the spirit or entity that you're trying to contact. So you probably get this. You would use like Venus for love and romance and sex and lustiness and all that kind of thing. And you would use maybe Jupiter for career and power and wealth and that type of thing, right? And on and on and on. So there are planetary tables related, aligned with, related with all of the classical planets. And you pick the one that makes the most sense to your need. And then you basically decide on a name, word, or phrase to sigilize. There are a lot of ways to do that. You can either choose just one punchy word that gets to the heart of what you're doing. You can use a sort of combination of methods and borrow something from the Austin Osman Spare method, which we're going to talk about here in a minute, to get it down to just some letters and then sigilize that. Or you can have this really complex, long sigil, that may be all over the place because you've written out a whole sentence. That's up to you. You do you. With this method, all of the letters of the alphabet are assigned to numbers. They all have numerical values. Now, a lot of people that are doing this in sort of more ceremonial systems or more ceremonial magical systems, or in the true Kamea method, are using Hebrew, which Hebrew letters, and they already know the numbers that are assigned to those letters, and it's a little bit easier to work with that way. But you can do this in literally any language, and the numbers for the English letters are here on this table that I am sharing with you now. And it's worth saying that I'm skipping a whole lot about the mysticism of the Hebrew alphabet and gematria and all of that stuff. It's all embedded into this particular system, and that's too much to go into right here. But it's there for those of you that are really interested in digging a little bit deeper into that. So after you have all of your numbers, you're going to plot the sequence of those numbers on your magic number table. So it's worth noting just a couple of things. First, you're going to start with a circle in the square, like in the space that has your very first number. And you're going to end by making a little short perpendicular line at the end of that number sequence. Throughout the middle of it, you can make little bumps or zigzags to denote a repeated number or letter, if that's a thing that you're including, and some systems wouldn't include that, so that's up to you. And you can also curve the lines in between in order to make them more visible within the sigil. So it's also worth noting that there's some numeric gymnastics that has to happen in order to make this system work for letters in English, or really for anything that's not Hebrew. So for instance, the word that I'm sigilizing here has an M in it, which is the number 40, but the English alphabet only has 26 letters. And the square I'm using, to complicate things further, only has 16 numbers on it anyway. So in a case like this, what I would do is I would drop the 0 off of the 40, making the number just 4. And I would treat that M as a number 4 instead of a number 40. I feel like at first glance the system looks overly complicated, but it really isn't once you start actually applying it. Although there's a lot of room for you to like dive deeper into it, because you can get into that gematria, you can get into that the meaning of numbers and the sacred relationship of numbers. There's room to complicate it if you like to do that kind of thing. And then the other thing that I like to remember when thinking about something that's sort of this involved and maybe this complicated is that some of the sorcery is actually in having to jump through these hoops and having to do this level of work and preparation. The next method that we're going to talk about is called the Rose Cross or the Rosy Cross method, and it comes to us from the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and it is based on this symbol. So embedded within this sigil method and within this symbol are mathematical, Kabbalistic, planetary, and elemental correspondences and alignments. So traditionally, folks who work with this method are using Hebrew letters, again, just like in the Kamea Method. And it's worth noting that the Hebrew letters are like the Norse runes in the sense that they are whole and complete symbols unto themselves, and they carry a whole bunch of meaning besides just being phonemes. A phoneme, by the way, let me be a geek about linguistics for just a second. Phonemes are units of sound in a language, and in English, and in our writing system, they're represented by a grapheme, which is one letter that represents one sound in a particular word. So even though a letter might have more than one sound that you can use to say it, when you're saying it in that moment, it usually just has one sound. You're not saying like both sounds. So for instance, the letter C can be S or K, but you're not saying sk or kol. Sorry, this is where I have to say that I'm a giant linguistics nerd, and I used to be a high school English teacher, so sorry, not sorry. All of that's to say that the Rosy Cross method, like the Kamea method, can be more complicated and a very rich system for folks who really want to have that level of layer upon layer of symbolism and intricacy. Or you can just use it to plot letters, and you can transliterate the Hebrew letters into English letters or into Cyrillic or into something else. Like, you can translate them into other graphemes that make sense for your usage. You just want to match them up as closely as you can with their Hebrew counterparts. And you may lose something in translation. And then if you're wanting to use a language whose graphemes, whose symbols, you know, the individual symbols that are used to comprise words, if those graphemes represent something other than a phoneme, so if they represent, for instance, a whole syllable, or they represent an entire word or a concept or something like that, you may have to get more creative than I'm prepared to do in this video, but I still believe it's possible, and I have faith in you. You might just have to have lots of petals on your rose. So to use this method, you're basically going to plot out your word or your phrase or your goal using the same markings that you would in the Kamea method. It's just going to be laid out in a very different format. Okay, and this brings us to the Austin Osman Spare method, which I mentioned briefly earlier. So Austin Osman Spare is like one of the big daddies of chaos magic. And there are probably things that Austin Osman Spare taught that have influenced your craft, and you might not even be aware of it. It's definitely worth a look into his writings, just to become a little bit more knowledgeable and educated on sort of the evolution of magic contemporarily. A.O. Spare was a contemporary of Aleister Crowley. He studied with Crowley a bit, and then they parted ways, and Crowley had some not nice things to say about him at one point, but honestly, from everything that I read, it's pretty much a matter of the pot calling the kettle black as far as that's concerned. With the A.O. Spare method, or the Austin Osman Spare method, we are starting to get into methods that allow for more of your own creativity to sort of shine through, and for your artistic nature to come out, which makes sense because Austin Osman Spare was an artist himself. So to create a sigil with this method, you want to write out in like full phrase or maybe even full sentence form your magical intention. And you want to put some thought into this, the way that you would with any magical intention or goal. As I am fond of saying, words mean stuff. So choose your words wisely and with care. So you're going to write the phrase out on a piece of paper, and then you're going to eliminate all of the vowels and eliminate all of the duplicate letters. What you're trying to do here is to kind of whittle down that initial phrase into a handful of letters that don't automatically read as that original phrase. And then you're going to take these letters and connect them in a way so that they make a symbol or a shape that's entirely new and different. It might not look like anything at all, or it might look like something that's sort of reminiscent of what your goal or your desire is. As far as that goes, that's entirely up to you. One of the concepts behind this particular method, by getting rid of all the letters and then rearranging them into a graphic symbol that isn't automatically read by your brain as the thing that you're trying to achieve, is that you know what it is. Subconsciously you know what it is, but this allows you to sort of let go of the death grip that you have on that magical intention, and to let the sigil do its work, to let the energy that you're putting behind it, or the spirit who's empowering it, have access to go and do that work without interference from you constantly checking on it. Okay, so this brings us to the last sigil method that we're going to talk about, which is the symbolic method. So I actually think that Laura Tempest Zaycroft's sigil work is really a great example, or constitutes a body of work that is a great example of symbolic sigil crafting. And you can see her work on Instagram. She's got a blog, and she has a fantastic book called Sigil Witchery. With this style of sigil creation, you're going to be creating a sigil that communicates your magical intention in a way that is pictographic and idiosyncratic. And so by that, what I mean is that it's very unique to you. That's the idiosyncratic part, because your relationship with the symbols that you've chosen is going to be different than my relationship with those same symbols because of your personal experiences. And then it's purely pictographic as well, because you're only using symbols and signs and that kind of thing. Actually, you can use letters in it, so you can use letters and numbers and just the whole gamut of symbols that you have access to. You can look around on your keyboard for symbols that have meaning to you. You can look at traffic symbols and the kinds of symbols that we use to help people navigate spaces and that type of thing. There's just a world of symbols that are available to us. So numbers, letters, planetary symbols, alchemical symbols, runic devices, modern icons, for instance, that get used in computer settings and internet settings, childhood symbols, you name it. If it's a symbol, you can use it. So what you do is you still start with maybe a phrase or a sentence that encapsulates your intention so that you're very clear about what it is that you're trying to communicate, but then you break it down into symbolic language. And then, just like in the AO spare method, you take those symbols and sort of recombine them into something that's greater than the sum of its parts, something new. You might still be able to see the individual symbols that are in there, and then again, maybe you won't, because maybe you want to make it so that something new emerges visually from the collection of these symbols. If this particular method resonates with you, I highly recommend creating a symbol lexicon for yourself, which is kind of like a dictionary of your personal symbols. This is something that I kind of recommend to my own students in general, because again, we interact with symbols in a very different way from person to person to person. So if we think about it, what snake means in one culture is different than what snake might mean in another culture. And really, even within that culture, what it means in this region might mean something different than it means in this region. Or like this type of snake has a slightly different meaning than that type of snake. But when we get onto a personal level, even beyond what the cultural associations in a particular time and place, and both time and place are really important when we're trying to say what a symbol means culturally, because those things change over time. But when we go from the culture and the society down to the individual, snake can mean something wildly different. Maybe the first pet that you remember in your home was a ball python named Miss Hiss, and she used to cuddle with you and keep you company, and you used to have tea parties together. You know, maybe she used to seek heat by curling up on the top of your head, and you wore her around like a hat. And you have very different associations with snake than, for instance, somebody who has a phobia about snakes. For you, snake is going to have a lot to do with like sweet noodly cuddles, in addition to all the things that it has to do with transformation and cycles, and you know, the like the Ouroboros symbol with the snake with the tail in its mouth, and you know, that infinity concept, and just all of those things. Like, you can recognize that all of those things exist, but then you have this other layer of what snake is. So getting in touch with your personal symbols is really important for doing this kind of work. And no author or expert on symbols, no symbol dictionary can tell you that. You have to figure it out for yourself. Oof, y'all. Oof. That's a lot. That's a lot of stuff we've gone over. This video is like way long and I still need to show you my work. So I'm going to be kind of quick on the empowering sigils part. So the short version of how to empower a sigil is this. Use the same kind of methods that you do with any other kind of talisman. That might be by empowering it with blood, that might be by using sexual energy, that might be by asking a spirit to enliven it. Whatever it is that you do, or like the selection of methods that you choose from, they all apply here. And you can put the sigil on practically anything. So you can paint it, you can carve it, you can, you know, pencil it onto something or ink it onto something. You can tattoo it onto yourself and wear it around for the rest of your life. And if it is that important of a sigil to you, I do have sigils on my body. There's one in white ink on my wrist, which is why I held that wrist up, because everybody sees this one, but you can't really see this one. You can make it fadeable, burnable, washable. You can make it permanent. All of that's up to you. So this one's super permanent, right? Like, it's not going away. It's here for as long as my body exists. But there's no end to the possibilities of what you can do in terms of how you actually apply the sigil and empower it and utilize it. Okay, so it's reveal time. So the larger magical intention that I've been working with is the phrase, I earn big money from my writing this year. That's the phrase that I used as my base for the places where a phrase was more appropriate. And in the places where a name or a specific spirit was more appropriate, there's a spirit that I was working with who I usually refer to as Mabel. That's not the spirit's full name, but that's the name that I use most of the time. So that's the name that I have sigilized here. Mabel helps bring me things, particularly money, and my whole family is in the habit now of every time my Etsy app cha-chings because I've made a sale, we all say, thanks, Mabel. So there you go. So Mabel gave me this sigil via spirit contact for the purpose of this work. And then I created these other two sigils for Mabel's name using the Kamea Method and the Rosy cross method. And then taking my full intention and distilling it down to just consonants that were not repeated, I came up with the letters BFWH S, and then created this sigil from those letters using the Austin Osman spare method. And then finally, using the symbolic method, I chose these symbols for this intention. So I used the $, a big one. I used the planetary symbols for Jupiter and Mercury. I used this symbol for Yule, and I'll be honest, I don't know where this symbol comes from. I don't think it's alchemical. I know that I first saw it in Scott Cunningham's Wicca, A Guide for the Solitary Practitioner, and it's all over the internet. For all I know, Scott created it himself, but hey, it works. But since Yule is roughly the end of the calendar year here in North America, it is the symbolic representation that I'm using for sort of the calendar timeline for this working. And then I used an ampersand to represent writing itself. A, because it always continues. It never ends. There's always more to write. And B, because I like the way it looks in scripts and scripting and handwriting. And then this is the sigil that I created. So there you go. 5 sigils for one magical outcome. So friends, that's all I have to say about that. And it was a lot. So I hope you found this very informative and inspirational. I hope that you go out and create tons of sigils for all kinds of magical goodness. And if you do, and if you're up for sharing, tag me on Instagram in some of the sigils that you create. If you found value in today's video, please bless me with the magic of the like button and tell your witchy friends that there is good stuff happening over here at Blade and Broom. It really helps out the channel. Leave comments down below. Let's get into talking about some sigils. What methods do you like? What sigil that I created most resonated with you personally? What method do you think that you might like to try, or what do you have questions about? I'm interested. And if you would like to add information like this, like the kind of information that we talk about here, to your own personal book of art, your grimoire, then I have a couple of freebies for you. Well, I have one freebie for you today. There is a free 13-page mini grimoire that you can click the link on the link down below and grab a copy of that. And then in my Etsy shop, if you're interested in way more pages, and I mean, like, I think I have over 700 now. 700 pages. It's a lot of pages. Including a couple of pages that just have to do with witchy symbols. Then those links are in my description box below. All right, friends, I will see you back here next Monday with more witchy goodness.